There was a time when dinner wasn't fancy, it was survival. When steel sparks lit the sky, and factory whistles called men home to steaming plates that told stories of sweat, struggle, and love. These weren't restaurant meals, they were blue-collar feasts, built from scraps and pride. But somewhere along the way, they vanished. Tonight, we're opening the kitchen door to 14 working-class dinners that once fed the backbone of America, and then disappeared without a trace. In the heart of America's working towns, from smoky Pittsburgh mills to dusty railroad camps, dinner wasn't just food. It was a ritual. Every bite carried the grit of long shifts, the echo of lunch pails, and the laughter of families who made the most of little. These forgotten blue-collar dinners shaped generations, long before convenience foods took over our plates. In this video, we're revisiting the flavors that fueled a nation, from miners' stews to factory casseroles, dishes born from hard work, hope, and the hunger to keep going. Before meal kits and microwaves, there was a dish that fueled the heartbeat of America's working class, a humble one-pot wonder known as boiler room stew. It wasn't a recipe found in cookbooks. It was born out of the clang of steel, the hiss of steam, and the long, punishing hours inside America's early industrial factories. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, boiler operators, mechanics, and mill workers didn't have time, or money, for fancy meals. What they had was grit, and whatever ingredients they could scrape together at day's end. Chunks of beef bone, a few potatoes, onions, and sometimes a lonely carrot, tossed into a dented tin pot that sat near the furnace or engine room. The slow heat of the boilers kept it simmering for hours, blending everything into a rich, smoky broth. By the end of a shift, the workers would gather, boots heavy with soot, to share that pot. No plates. Just ladles and tin cups. They called it boiler room stew, not for its elegance, but for its endurance. It represented the soul of blue-collar America, men and women who turned exhaustion into community, and leftovers into comfort. Sometimes, a worker's wife would send bits of barley or cabbage from home, adding warmth to the pot. Other times, it was just bones and broth, but it was enough. In those factories, where the air shimmered with heat and metal, this stew became more than food. It was survival. Today, boiler room stew has all but vanished. But if you close your eyes and imagine that slow simmering sound, you can almost hear the heartbeat of a nation that refused to quit, one bowl at a time. In the roaring 1930s, when paychecks shrank and dreams were rationed, the American dinner table changed. Meat became a luxury, yet families still gathered each night, determined to keep tradition alive. And from that struggle came a dish that symbolized resilience: the factory ham loaf. Unlike its richer cousin, the meat loaf, this was a Depression-era creation built from necessity, not abundance. Housewives near Pennsylvania's steel towns and Midwest factory belts would save every scrap of leftover ham, even the fatty edges and smoked bits. Those pieces were ground together with breadcrumbs, a splash of milk, and just enough egg to hold the shape. It wasn't pretty, but it filled bellies and stretched pennies. The loaf was baked slow, often topped with a sweet glaze of ketchup and brown sugar, turning scarcity into something strangely comforting. The smell drifted through narrow row houses, mixing with the sound of factory whistles and the shuffle of boots coming home from the night shift. Families would slice it thin, serve it with boiled potatoes or creamed corn, a full dinner that cost less than a dime per plate. In many towns, this ham loaf became a Sunday ritual, a small reminder that dignity could survive even when the pantry was nearly empty. Some say its origin traces back to Pennsylvania Dutch communities who adapted old European sausage-making methods for lean times. Others believe it began in factory cafeterias where cooks reused trimmings to feed hundreds of workers. Either way, the factory ham loaf became the quiet hero of Depression kitchens. Today, It's nearly forgotten, replaced by convenience foods and prepackaged comfort. But for one generation, that humble loaf represented more than dinner. It was proof that love, when baked slow and shared together, could taste like hope. There's a saying among old railroad men: you could tell a man's route by the smell of his hash. And in the early 1900s, that hash, sizzling on a battered skillet over a campfire, was a lifeline. Railroad hash wasn't born in a kitchen. It was born on the rails, in the in-between places where America's veins of steel stretched from coast to coast. Conductors, brakemen, and engineers worked grueling hours, sleeping in boxcars or bunkhouses, eating when and where they could. Restaurants were rare, money was tighter, and hunger didn't wait for payday. So they improvised. Every man brought something: diced potatoes from one, salt pork from another, maybe some leftover corned beef or onions. Tossed together on a cast iron pan, fried crisp in bacon grease until the air smelled like smoke and comfort. It wasn't fancy, but it filled the stomach, warmed the bones, and built a bond stronger than steel. Some called it hobo hash, others just railroad stew. But the idea was the same: take what you've got and make it count. By the 1920s, this dish had spread from rail camps to small-town diners, where cooks tried to capture that same rugged flavor. They'd serve it with a fried egg on top, a nod to the men who laid the tracks that made America move. For the workers, railroad hash meant more than a meal. It was a ritual after endless miles, a reminder that they were part of something bigger. And even as the locomotives faded and the old camps fell silent, that scent of sizzling potatoes and meat still lingers in history, a whisper of iron, sweat, and brotherhood cooked over a glowing ember in the night. In the textile towns of New England and the steel valleys of Pennsylvania, the hum of the mills never stopped. And when the factory whistle blew at dusk, tired families hurried home to the comforting aroma of something humble, yet deeply satisfying: cabbage bake. This dish was born from the kitchens of immigrant mill workers, Polish, Irish, German, and Hungarian families who brought their old world flavors into America's new industrial life. Money was scarce, meat was precious, but cabbage? That was cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile. In small, steamy kitchens, mothers would shred cabbage, mix it with onions, scraps of ground beef or sausage, and pour over a little tomato sauce or broth. Then they'd layer it in battered baking pans and let it cook slowly in wood-fired ovens. The scent drifted through tenement halls, a signal that the day's work was done and warmth was waiting. Some called it per man's casserole, others lazy galumki, after the stuffed cabbage rolls it imitated. But no one cared about the name. What mattered was that it stretched a few cents' worth of food into a family feast. Around those small kitchen tables, children ate quietly, fathers told stories of long shifts, and mothers added a secret ingredient: pride. Because even in hardship, they created comfort. By the 1940s, mill workers' cabbage bake became a symbol of thrift and togetherness. You could find versions of it in church cookbooks and union newsletters, a dish that belonged to everyone, yet no one claimed. Today, it's nearly forgotten, buried under decades of convenience foods. But one bite of that tender cabbage, rich sauce, and smoky meat, and you'd remember what it meant to feed a family, not just with food, but with heart. Long before plastic lunchboxes and break-room microwaves, America's blue-collar workers carried something far sturdier: a dented metal lunch pail. And inside it, wrapped in brown paper or wax cloth, often rested a forgotten treasure of working-class ingenuity: the tin lunch pie. It wasn't dessert. It was survival disguised as comfort. These small, hand-sized pies were the perfect meal for miners, machinists, and steelworkers who spent 12-hour shifts in noise, dust, and heat. Packed by wives before dawn, They were meant to last all day, no refrigeration, no utensils, no fuss. A tin lunch pie could be sweet or savory, depending on what the family had. Meat scraps and gravy on one day, apples or berries on another. Some were stuffed with mashed potatoes and onions, others with leftover stew thickened to travel. The crust was dense and sturdy, baked to seal everything in, like edible armor against time and toil. In the coal towns of West Virginia and the iron ranges of Minnesota, these pies were more than food. They were messages from home. A wife might carve her husband's initials into the crust, or tuck in a note, "Be safe today." That small gesture, hidden beneath layers of dough, carried love through the miles of underground tunnels and factory floors. By the 1930s, tin lunch pies were everywhere: rail yards, shipyards, lumber camps. But as factories modernized and canned goods took over, the ritual faded. Lunch became something you bought, not something made with care at 4 a.m. Still, those old tins remain, rusted, dented, but full of memory. Each one tells the same quiet story, that the strongest meals weren't just cooked in kitchens, they were carried in the hands of people who built a nation, one bite at a time. At dawn, the harbor would stir before the sun even touched the waves. Wooden boats rocked against the docks, gulls cried overhead, and the smell of salt, diesel, and fresh catch filled the air. For the men and women of America's coastal towns, this was the rhythm of life, and at the end of every long, wet day, there was one dish that brought them home: dockside fish chowder. It wasn't the creamy restaurant kind we know today. This chowder was rougher, leaner, born from the decks of small boats and shanty kitchens that dotted the New England coast in the late 1800s. Fishermen would take whatever didn't sell at market, small cod, pollock, or clams, and toss them into a pot with onions, salt pork, and broken ship biscuits to thicken it. It simmered on wood stoves while nets were mended and boots dried by the fire. The smell alone could stop a sailor in his tracks, smoky, briny, and rich with the day's labor. Mothers would ladle it into chipped bowls, and families would sit shoulder to shoulder, eating in silence except for the clinking of spoons and the hum of the sea outside. For dockworkers and fishermen, dockside fish chowder wasn't just dinner, it was recovery. A hot bowl after cold hands, a taste of gratitude after risk. Every spoonful carried the story of survival on uncertain tides. By the 1940s, as canneries replaced small boats and chain restaurants commercialized New England chowder, the original version began to disappear. But those who grew up on it still remember: the broth light, the fish tender, the salt pork smoky, like the sea itself, simple but endlessly deep. It was the ocean's thank you to the ones who dared to earn their living from it. Before diners and drive-thrus dotted every highway, America's working families found comfort in something far simpler: the potato and onion griddle fry. It was the meal that didn't need a recipe, only a hot pan, a few vegetables, and the will to make something out of almost nothing. From factory boarding houses to farm kitchens, this dish was the backbone of survival through the 1920s and 1930s, especially during the Great Depression, when a single sack of potatoes could feed a family for a week. After long days at the mill or in the fields, mothers would slice onions thin, fry them in bacon grease or lard until they turned golden and sweet, then toss in diced potatoes. The sound of that sizzling pan filled the house, sharp, familiar, and comforting. Salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika if luck allowed. Sometimes a bit of leftover meat or gravy was added, but often it was just potatoes and onions. Families gathered around old wooden tables, eating straight from the skillet, laughing softly between bites. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. This dish carried across regions and generations. In mining towns, they'd call it miner's breakfast. In rural farms, it was supper fry. And in cities, it became the base for diner hash, a taste of home in every greasy spoon. When World War II rationing hit, the potato and onion griddle fry became a quiet hero again. Simple, cheap, and hearty, it filled bellies without wasting a crumb. Today, it's nearly vanished, buried under layers of modern convenience. But if you've ever fried potatoes in a little oil and heard that soft crackle, you've already tasted a piece of history, a reminder that sometimes the simplest meals carried the greatest strength. Detroit, 1935. The air buzzed with the roar of machinery and the rhythm of wrenches. The men on the line moved fast, one motion after another, thousands of cars born each day under the glare of factory lights. But when the whistle finally blew, there was only one thing that could warm the bones and quiet the noise in their heads: assembly line chili. It wasn't the Texas kind, heavy with spice and beef. This chili belonged to the working class, rough, hearty, and endlessly adaptable. It was the dish of factory cafeterias, garage cookouts, and union picnics. A few pounds of ground beef, onions, crushed tomatoes, kidney beans if you had them, and enough chili powder to feel alive again after 10 hours on your feet. Some say it started in the Ford plants, where immigrant workers from Mexico and the South brought their own flavors to the industrial heart of America. They mixed spice with thrift, adding flour to thicken and stretching a few ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire crew. On cold Michigan nights, that pot of chili was more than food, it was fellowship. Workers shared bowls over laughter, union talk, and the faint hum of machines cooling down in the distance. Each batch was a little different, depending on who stirred the pot. By the 1940s, assembly line chili became a staple of community halls and factory towns across the Midwest. It symbolized teamwork, built from many hands, seasoned with resilience. Today, when chili simmers on a modern stovetop, few remember where it came from. But in every bite, there's still that same story of tired hands, proud hearts, and the spicy comfort that kept America's engines running, one bowl at a time. Deep in the pine forests of the northern states, where the air smelled of sap and sawdust, men rose before sunrise to the echo of axes and the creak of frozen trees. These were America's lumberjacks, giants of grit who cut timber through the snow and wind. And their fuel? A simple, smoky pot known as lumberjack beans and salt pork. It wasn't glamorous, but it was legendary. At the logging camps of Maine, Michigan, and Wisconsin during the late 1800s, this meal was as essential as the tools they swung. Beans were cheap, lasted all winter, and filled the stomach. Salt pork, preserved slabs of fat-cured meat, gave the flavor and strength needed for 12-hour shifts in the cold. Camp cooks, known as cookie, would start the pot before dawn. Beans soaked overnight were simmered slowly with chunks of salt pork, molasses, and maybe a splash of vinegar for bite. By the time the men returned from the woods, the smell drifted through camp like a promise, sweet, smoky, and alive with warmth. They ate it in tin bowls seated on stumps, steam fogging in the freezing air. No one spoke much, they just ate, grateful for something hot, heavy, and made with care. That pot of beans connected them all, strangers turned brothers by labor and hunger. By the early 1900s, the recipe spread beyond the camps, appearing in logging town cookbooks and church suppers. It became a working-class symbol, proof that even the simplest food could carry pride. Today, that same mix of beans and salt pork is nearly forgotten, but its spirit lingers. It's the taste of strength, of hard work done by hand, a meal that didn't just feed men, but kept the very heartbeat of early America alive beneath the whispering pines. As the sun dipped low over golden fields, the sound of crickets filled the air and the day's labor finally came to an end. Dust clung to overalls, sweat dried on weary faces, and the smell of something comforting drifted from the farmhouse kitchen, cornbread supper. This wasn't just dinner. It was a quiet celebration of survival. For generations of American farmhands, especially through the late 1800s and early 1900s, cornbread was more than a side dish, it was the meal itself. Cheap, filling, and made with ingredients grown from their own land, it was the taste of home after a day of hard-earned work. Women mixed cornmeal, lard, buttermilk, and eggs in heavy iron skillets, then slid them into wood-fired ovens. The scent of baking cornbread filled the air, nutty, warm, and faintly smoky. Sometimes it was eaten plain with a drizzle of honey, sometimes drenched in milk, or paired with beans, onions, or collard greens if the garden allowed. Every family had its own ritual. Some broke the bread by hand at the table, others served it right from the skillet, passing slices around as lantern light flickered against the walls. Conversation was soft, talk of weather, harvest, and hope. This simple supper carried deep roots, especially in the South and Midwest. During the Great Depression, when wheat flour was scarce and money tighter than ever, cornbread became a hero once again, cheap to make, hard to waste, and always satisfying. To the farmhands, it wasn't poverty food, it was pride food. A reminder that even when times were tough, the earth still gave enough to fill a pan and feed a family. Today, cornbread is often seen as a side, but once upon a time, it was supper. And in that golden crust lived the spirit of America's hardest workers, humble, hungry, and hopeful. Down in the mining towns of Colorado, Nevada, and West Virginia, life wasn't measured in hours, it was measured in shifts, sweat, and survival. When the men climbed out of those dark tunnels, faces black with coal dust, there was only one thing they craved, a hot plate of slumgullion. The name sounded strange, even back then, but to miners it meant one thing, food that filled the belly, no matter what it was made of. Born in the mid-1800s during the gold rush, slumgullion started as a stew of pure improvisation. Whatever scraps were left, bits of meat, beans, potatoes, onions, sometimes even macaroni, all went into one pot to simmer until the flavors became one. Every mining camp had its own version. Some used venison or salt pork, others threw in canned tomatoes or corn if they were lucky. But no two pots ever tasted the same. It was food without pride, yet made with love, rough, hearty, and always shared. Cooks would serve it from battered ladles into tin bowls while the miners sat shoulder to shoulder, boots still caked in mud, laughter echoing through the shanty mess halls. It was the one time of day when the danger of the mines faded, replaced by the comfort of something hot and homemade. As the years passed, the term slumgullion found its way into logging camps, rail yards, even military mess tents. It became shorthand for any stew of scraps, but its heart remained in those mining towns, feeding men who risked their lives for $1 and a dream. Today, the word has nearly vanished, but the spirit hasn't. Slumgullion wasn't about what you had, it was about what you made of it. And in that battered pot, miners found something stronger than gold, a taste of home in the toughest places on earth. When the factory whistles blew and hundreds of tired workers poured out onto the dusty yard, there was one smell that could stop them in their tracks, chili bubbling away in a dented tin pot. This was factory yard chili, a working man's reward after a backbreaking shift, built from scraps, spice, and pure grit. In the 1930s and 40s, chili wasn't just food, it was fuel. Factory towns across America, from Detroit to Pittsburgh, relied on it. The recipe was simple and flexible: ground beef if you had it, beans if you didn't, maybe a few onions, peppers, and a splash of yesterday's coffee for depth. It was slow-cooked right beside the yard gates, often in old oil drums cleaned and repurposed into makeshift cook pots. Women from nearby neighborhoods or wives of workers would set up small food stalls by the factory fences, serving this chili in tin cups or wrapped bread bowls. It was hearty, spicy, and warming, perfect for men whose hands were cracked from metal and grease. For just a few cents, you could fill your stomach and share a laugh before trudging home. This wasn't the chili of diners or contests. It was humble, smoky, and often stretched with beans and cornmeal to feed more mouths. But in every spoonful, there was a sense of pride. A reminder that no matter how tough the job or how long the hours, there was still comfort waiting at the end of the day. Today, the factory yard chili has mostly vanished, replaced by fast food lunches and microwaved meals. But for those who still remember, that chili didn't just feed the body, it fed the spirit of America's hardest workers. Deep beneath the ground, in the cold tunnels of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, miners carried with them more than tools, they carried hunger. And when they came up to daylight, covered in coal dust and sweat, they craved one thing, the miner's pancake stack. This wasn't your Sunday brunch kind of pancake. No whipped cream, no syrup drizzle. These were heavy, dense, and built to last from dawn to dusk. Miners' wives would mix simple ingredients: flour, eggs, lard, and molasses, sometimes adding cornmeal for texture. The batter was thick, and the pancakes were fried in bacon grease until golden and crisp on the edges. Each one was layered like armor, stacked high, and packed into metal lunch pails to keep the men full through grueling shifts. They were often eaten cold, paired with whatever could be spared, a slice of salt pork, a few pickles, or strong black coffee from a thermos. But despite their simplicity, these pancakes were a miner's comfort. Each bite reminded them of home, of family waiting above the ground, and of the small joys that light could bring after a long day in the dark. In some mining towns, these pancake stacks became a community tradition. On payday mornings, miners would gather at local church basements where volunteers flipped hundreds of pancakes on cast iron griddles. The smell filled the whole block: sweet molasses, sizzling fat, and pride in hard work. Today, the miner's pancake stack is a forgotten symbol of endurance, a recipe forged from necessity and love. It stood for survival, faith, and unity among America's blue-collar families. Because in those days, food wasn't about luxury, it was about fuel for hope. And a stack of pancakes could mean the strength to face another day underground. Before drive-through burgers and convenience stores lined America's highways, the lifeline of this country ran on steel, and the men who rode those rails needed meals that could travel with them. That's where the railroad man's meatloaf sandwich came in. The ultimate blue-collar fuel for miles of track and endless workdays. It started in the late 1800s and carried well into the mid-20th century. Railroad cooks and train-yard families knew one truth: meatloaf could stretch a pound of ground beef into a week's worth of meals. It was cheap, hearty, and tasted just as good cold as it did hot. Workers would slice thick slabs of leftover meatloaf, sandwich them between sturdy bread, sometimes homemade, sometimes just yesterday's loaf, and slather on a bit of ketchup, mustard, or even cold gravy. The aroma of these sandwiches often mingled with coal smoke and diesel oil. Conductors, engineers, and brakemen would unwrap them on long hauls, eating right there in the cab or on the edge of a station platform. It was messy, it was honest, and it tasted like home, even hundreds of miles away. Families, too, made it part of their rhythm. Wives packed them in wax paper for husbands heading out before dawn, sometimes slipping in an apple or a note inside. Those little gestures turned a simple sandwich into something deeply personal, a reminder of love carried across miles of iron and noise. By the 1960s, as dining cars became fancier and convenience food took over, the humble meatloaf sandwich slowly vanished. But for decades, it was the working man's companion, warm or cold, always there when needed. Today, it stands as one of America's most quietly heroic meals, proof that comfort doesn't come from a kitchen's luxury, but from the hands that made it. Because for the railroad man, that sandwich wasn't just lunch, it was home between two slices of bread. They say history is written in ink, but sometimes, it's cooked in cast iron. These 14 blue-collar dinners weren't just recipes. They were reflections of a nation built on grit, faith, and the quiet dignity of work. From mill hands to miners, from dockworkers to trainmen, every dish told a story of survival, family, and love served at the end of a long day. Each meal we've revisited today was born not in luxury, but in resilience. They turned scraps into suppers, leftovers into legends, and empty tables into memories that still echo through old kitchens and factory towns. Somewhere out there, an old steelworker's daughter still remembers the smell of cabbage bake on a Tuesday night. A miner's grandson still flips pancakes the way his grandfather's wife did, and maybe, just maybe, these recipes still live on quietly in forgotten notebooks and family boxes tucked in attics. If these stories stirred something in you, a memory, a hunger, or even just a sense of wonder, then don't let them fade again. Because keeping them alive is what keeps our history alive. So before you go, hit that subscribe button and become part of this journey to rediscover America's lost suppers, one forgotten recipe at a time. And in the comments, tell me, which of these blue-collar dinners would you bring back to your own table tonight? This is more than just food. This is heritage on a plate.